In this tutorial, I'm going to walk through how to set up monsters in Dungeon Builder. The first thing you need to know about monsters is that Dungeon Builder does not come with preloaded monsters. Each game master has to populate his own database of monsters. And the process of populating those monsters works in 3 simple steps of setup, load, and use. In this tutorial, we'll cover the first step, as well as how to manually load monsters. A second tutorial, importing monsters, will address how to automatically load monsters, and 2 other tutorials, creating encounter tables and managing encounters, will address how to use monsters. Turning to the first step of setup, this step takes place on the admin control panel and is actually discussed in some depth in the tutorial of the same name. However, to briefly recap that discussion, the Setup Monster tab up here is used to identify characteristics of monsters that cut across all monsters of all types. These characteristics are then populated to drop-down list boxes that are used to define your monsters, and I'll show you how that works in just a moment. What you need to understand about the Setup Monster tab are the following points. First, while Dungeon Builder may not come preloaded with monsters, it does come preloaded with common forms of each characteristic that applies to all monsters. So, every game master will have access to the amphibian, the animal, the beetle, the insect classes, as well as the bite, sting, and weapon attacks. This will facilitate future exchanges of monsters among game masters. That said, each game master can make their own classes, their own attack types, and their own movement types as well. All you have to do is click on this little plus sign up here, and you'll be prompted to enter the name of your new class. I'm going to enter a couple of examples here to give you an idea of what I mean. First of all, enter the class or monster type, plant. And you'll see how it appears here in the specific category, which in the version of Dungeon Builder that you're using probably says the your category. And I'll enter a specific attack type of grapple. And once again, it's populated into the specific category. If you want to rename the characteristic, all you have to do is select the characteristic you want to change and click on this little pencil here. And it allows you to edit the name. And likewise, if you want to delete it, you click on the minus sign and it'll ask you to confirm that you want to delete it. The thing you have to be careful with here is if any of these items, class, attack type, movement type, etc. are used by a monster in any of your campaigns, it will be deleted from their profile. So you got to be careful about doing that. The final comment is that in this common category here, and by the way, this list may look a little different than what you're seeing at this time. You can't delete any of these. These are defaults that are cutting across all of the different subscribers to Dungeon Builder. You can choose to use them or choose not to use them, but you cannot edit or remove them. Now, once your setup is taken care of, the next step is to click on the Monster tab down here at the bottom of the gaming space to define your monsters. And we'll show you how these values are used when you do that. So let's take a look at loading monsters. There are 2 ways to load monsters in Dungeon Builder. You can enter them one at a time manually using the screens I'm about to walk through, or you can use our CSV import utility to import up to 100 monsters at a time. The import facility can be really handy if you play with a group that all uses the same sets of monsters. One person loads up the spreadsheet, and then everyone else can share it by loading it up to their instance of Dungeon Builder. As I said earlier, we'll talk more about the import tool in a separate tutorial. Okay, let's dive into the process of entering monsters using the Dungeon Builder screens. We are presently on the Overview tab here. And there are 4 other screens of monster information that we will go through. However, the Overview screen contains the core encounter-related attributes of each monster. So we'll focus our discussion on this screen. Before looking at each field on this screen, let me orient you a little bit. First, Dungeon Builder does not require that you fill out each and every field in order to use your monsters. In fact, from a system perspective, only the monster name field is required. And right now you'll see that the monster name field is blank. And that will be the condition when you first purchase your Game Master license. There'll be no monsters loaded. However, there are 4 fields that I would call mandatory in that they are required in order to generate encounters. Those fields are monster name, experience, armor class, and hit points. And all 4 of them are here on the Overview screen. With just these 4 fields filled in, you can use your monsters to create encounter tables and to generate random monster encounters. All the other fields are helpful reference information that you can quickly look up using Dungeon Builder, but they are not needed to create and use a monster. Second, notice this little button bar up here on the Overview tab. It does not appear on the other monster tabs. For example, you don't see it on the Encounter tab or Abilities or Movement. Okay, it's only on the Overview tab here. Well, this very important little button bar has 4 buttons that follow our convention of new, rename, delete, and save. But there's a 5th button here for importing the monster spreadsheet. So when you want to import a spreadsheet, this is the button you'll click on. And as I said, we talk about that in a separate tutorial. Looking first at the name field, once again, it's empty. However, notice that the monster class field is pre-populated with all those values that we showed you up on the Setup Monster tab. All the different standard ones are here, as well as the plant class that we just entered. We also have monster level, which allows you entries of 1 through 20, as well as an alignment bar, which is sort of like a slider. You click on the value that you want. And we have fields for experience, attacks, notes, etc. Now, as I said a moment ago, not all of these fields are mandatory. Just name, experience, armor class, and hit points are required to save a usable monster. Everything else is optional. I'm going to enter an example now. I'll start off with a sea dragon, and I'll begin by clicking on the new button and enter dragon C. And click OK. And now sea dragon appears in the monster name field. I'll now choose the dragon class for my common classes. And then I'll set the experience to 4,500, base as well as 20 per hit point. Next, I'll set the armor class to 40. There we go. And I can have any value from minus 100 to 100 on the spin wheel. One thing to note here is that the values for armor class and hit dice will appear on the encounter battle sheet for monsters when Dungeon Builder rolls up an encounter. That's one of the reasons why they're mandatory. Now, hit points over here uses our die cup widget. You can select up to 999 dice. I'm not going to do that, but you can have 999 dice. And you can choose everything from a die 1, which is unique, to a die 100. So if you wanted to enter a solitary individual like Demogorgon, you would enter the value of 1 and choose a D1, and that would give you a unique entry. And you can also assign a modifier to the hit dice. And this modifier is on a die cut basis. It's not on a per die basis. And that modifier can be up to as high as 99. Now I'm going to enter 14 die 10 plus 10 as my hit points. And I want to save that just to be safe. And now let's go back up to attacks. And attacks has its own little section within the monster overview page. Attacks are represented here as a table, and it will display 3 attacks at the same time. Now, a monster may have an unlimited number of attacks, but what will happen is that this scroll bar here, this vertical scroll bar, will become active when you have 4 or more attacks. But my sea dragon is only going to have a couple. In order to create his first attack, which will be a breath weapon, I'll click on New. And up comes the attacks dialog. As attacks are somewhat complicated, we've broken the data up into sections. First, you declare what type of attack the attack is. And here we see that there's a list of different types of attack types that are specified under Monster Setup, and I'm going to choose Breath Weapon. Next, you choose how frequently the attack can be used. I'm going to say it can be used once every turn, okay? But you can have any period you want here, and you can have multiple uses per time increment, so don't feel constrained to just do it once per round. It can be multiple times per round, per hour, per day, whatever. Now, at the moment, this information is just for reference purposes, but in later versions of Dungeon Builder, the game clock is going to track the attacks for the Game Master so he doesn't get confused about who's used what attack when, and he can keep track of what's going on in the melee round. But once again, for now, it's just for reference. We then define the non-magical effects of the attack. Notice how the non-magical effects are on their own tab here. Future versions of Dungeon Builder will have tabs for magical attacks, mental attacks, and other forms of attack. But right now we're focused upon a physical attack, and once again we use the mini die cup to indicate how much damage is done per attack. Now this spin wheel can go up to 99, so you can have up to 99 total dice of a given type, and we have a broad range of dice that you can choose from, plus a modifier. And I'm going to choose 1 die 6, and I'm going to say a plus 2 for a modifier, and I can also apply that per hit die of the monster. Now, this doesn't do anything right now with Inside Dungeon Builder. This is for reference purposes, but in later versions, it'll actually calculate the damage should you choose to use this attack. That takes care of the physical part of non-magical attacks. Then for poison and infection, there really isn't that to a breath weapon in this case. So we're basically done. I'll save this. And there is the first attack, the breath weapon attack. Now, let's say I wanted to enter a second attack. Say the sea dragon has a poison sting. I'll select that sting. It can be used once every round. It has no physical damage, but it does kill you if you receive it. There is no duration associated with death. It's pretty much permanent. There is a saving throw. If you save, you are paralyzed. And the duration of the paralysis is 12 days. How's that? That'll ruin your day. And I'll save that. And you'll notice now that the sting is populated the table as well, and we show that there is something on the attack dialog that is significant. If there had been an infection, it would have showed up here as well. And when we do magical attacks, psionic attacks, things like that, they will show up here as well. And those are the basics of setting up a monster in Dungeon Builder. I'm now going to jump ahead and add a couple of more monsters just to flesh things out a bit, because I want to show you something in a moment. And then we'll walk through the other monster screens. Okay, looking at the other tabs, if you want to further customize your monsters, you can. The Encounter tab is pretty neat in that you use it to define associated monsters. What that means is you can tell Dungeon Builder whether it should check for monsters that typically are associated with the instant monster that you're defining. For example, wolves are often associated with orcs. So for a given number of orcs, you would expect to find some wolves tagging along. Well, this is where you specify such relationships. Let me run through an example. Presently, we're on Sea Dragon, but I'm going to move that to Orc. And then I'm going to associate a wolf with orcs. Now, stepping back a moment, this little drop-down list box up here is very powerful. You'll notice that it's carried through on each of the tabs for all the monsters, okay? And as you add monsters to Dungeon Builder, this list will get very, very long, okay? Well, what this allows you to do is to jump back and forth between different monsters, and that makes comparisons between the monsters and various attributes very easy to do. But for the moment, we're just trying to associate a wolf with an orc, so we'll stick with that. And now what I do with these other fields is to specify the parameters under which wolves will be found with orcs. For example, I'm going to say that for every 20 orcs, and I'll click on down here, we should check for wolves. And if we do check for wolves, I'm going to give them a 40% chance of there being a wolf. So if I have 18 orcs in my encounter, there's no chance of a wolf. But if I have 21 orcs in an encounter, well, then there's a 40% chance of there being wolves. And then I'm going to specify the number of wolves occurring to be 2d6. And I'm going to set multiple to yes. And I'll tell you what that means in just a second. I'm going to save this just to be safe. So let me explain how this works. As presently defined on this screen, if I roll up an encounter of 1 to 19 orcs, there is no chance of there being any wolves as I did not hit the threshold number of 20 orcs. However, if there are 20 to 39 orcs, then there's a 40% chance of 2 to 12 wolves also being present. And the multiple field comes into play when there are more than 20 orcs. Say there's 100 orcs. When multiple is set to no, then Dungeon Builder only checks for the wolves once, no matter how many orcs are present. So in my example of 100 orcs, if this were no, Dungeon Builder would only check once because the threshold was hit at 20, but multiple is set to no. However, if multiple is set to yes, as it is in this case, now we divide that threshold number of 20 into the actual encounter number of 100, and we get 5 instances of 20 orcs. What that means is that we're now going to roll that 40% chance of 2 to 12 wolves 5 times. So there could be a great many wolves running around with these orcs. Now the great thing about Dungeon Builder is that when an encounter is rolled, Dungeon Builder will also roll up any associated monsters at the same time. So the number of monsters, the hit points, and the experience points of any associated monsters are also automatically generated. And the associated monsters will also print out on the encounter battle sheet. So now you can actually get rich encounters that have multiple monster types in them. I think that's pretty neat. Hopefully you do too. Moving on to the Abilities tab, we've provided a collection of standard abilities here at the top that apply to both monsters and characters. Now, none of these fields are mandatory and you do not have to use them, but we've tried to provide a good mix of attributes to support a broad array of fantasy role-playing environments. One note is that the abilities indexes for both the major and minor scales, this is the major scale, this is the minor scale, go from 0 to 100. Now the language section displays those languages that were defined on the Monster Setup tab on the left, and you then use these arrows here to add or remove languages from a specific monster. It's pretty straightforward. And the vision table down here at the bottom allows you to capture vision-related information under different conditions. And you'll notice that we make a distinction between detection range and 20/20 clarity range. And this is to account for the fact that creatures like eagles might be able to detect that something is present at around 10,000 feet and see it as well as you and I see 20/20 at about 200 feet, as an eagle's vision is anywhere from 4 to 10 times better than our vision. And that's it for the Abilities tab. Now let's move on to the Attributes tab. And here we capture the physical dimensions of the monster as well as their load-bearing capability. Now all this information is merely for reference purposes. Once again, it's not mandatory. But it will be helpful if you enter this information now into dimensions, because in future versions of Dungeon Builder, we want to account for monster size when we have a movable monster icon that'll make sure you don't do things like having an ancient huge red dragon go into a 10 by 10 room. You might be able to get a dragon in a 10 by 10 room, but it'll probably be an egg. The load-bearing capacity function is actually pretty straightforward. All it is an algorithm that applies different movement rates and carrying capacities based upon the maximum carrying capacity of that monster. Like say that a plains orc can carry 200 pounds. Well, that means if he's carrying his maximum weight, he can only move at about 10% of his normal movement rate because he's basically staggering under the load, and he can only do it for about 5 minutes at a time before he's exhausted. Okay. However, if he's carrying 80 pounds, which is a pretty good approximation of a good-sized hobbit, he can move at about 80% of his movement rate, and he can do so for a half hour at a stretch. And at 20% of your maximum weight carrying capacity, you basically can move for an indefinite period of time. And finally, we have the Movement tab, and this is a little bit different. Recall that we had a bunch of common movement types defined on the Admin Control panel. Well, as you add your own movement types on the Setup Monster tab, new rows will appear down here to reflect those new movement types. Now, most monsters will only have 3 to 5 of these being present, but if you want to have more, feel free. But what is important for you to do is to identify what is the default movement type, which will, in most cases, be a walk. This is important as we are intending to enable movement rates for monsters in an upcoming release. And that is it for entering the monsters using the screens in Dungeon Builder. So let me close with a final comment on use. This last topic, how you use monsters, will be covered in separate tutorials. The most important use for your monsters will be to build custom encounter tables on the Admin Control panel using this tab. And once those encounter tables are created, then you'll generate your random monster encounters or your set encounters in dungeon rooms. But as both of these topics are quite large, we have developed separate tutorials for each of them. See creating encounter tables and managing encounters. One thing I do want to mention before closing is that if you happen to delete a monster from your database by using this delete button over here, okay, this trash can, if that monster is used in any encounter that you have already created and placed in a room or on your encounters list, it will be deleted from that location. So something to remember. Okay, that's it for defining monsters. Watch the creating encounter tables and managing encounters tutorials to see how all of this information comes together and is used to take your adventure to the next level. Thank you.